Thank you for joining our Abbasi program Tuesday talk. This is our first in this quarter. My name is Ali Ajioğlu. I'm the director of the program and professor of history here at Stanford. Today it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Riza Yildirim from the University of Vienna. This event is co-sponsored by the Middle Eastern Studies Forum and the program of Turkey at the Center on Democracy, Development and Rule of Law. Thank you, Ayşe, for co-sponsoring my channel. Professor Yildirim is a historian of the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran and a scholar of religion and theology, specializing in Islamic heterodoxy, Shiism and Sufism, with particular emphasis on Alevism and Bektashism. He earned his first PhD from Bilkent University, where his dissertation examined the formation of the Kızılbaş movement within the context of Ottoman Safavid imperial rivalry. Riza and I were both fortunate to study with Professor Ali İnalcık, the towering figure of Ottoman studies, and we belonged to the last generation of his students together. And I later came to know Riza more closely at Harvard, where he was a visiting fellow in 2006 and 7 and 8. After teaching in Turkey at the University of Economics and Technology for a couple of years in Ankara, during his actual teaching, he published his first major monograph, The Hagiography of Sayyid Ali Sultan, a study of a 14th century saint in the Western Thrace. He then pursued a second PhD in the Department of Religion at Emory University. So he has two PhDs, one in history, one is in theology and religious studies. During and after his doctoral work at Emory, he produced a series of back-breaking and groundbreaking studies on Alevism and Bektashism across the Ottoman Empire, Safavid Iran, and modern Turkey. His scholarship stands out for its rare ability to combine rigorous historical analysis with theological insight and ethnographic research. Today, he is considered as one of the most influential voices in the field of Alevi studies. Most recently, he was appointed professor of Alevi theology at the University of Vienna. In addition to his work as a historian and a scholar of religion, Riza also has trained in physics, and he's highly skilled in computer programming and coding, something that we hope will open exciting opportunities for collaboration in digital humanities in the near future. After the talk, I will take you to Tesla. Today's talk examines the historical background of the AKP, Justice and Development Party, AKP's policies towards the Alevi community in Turkey, and explains why these initiatives ultimately failed, despite sustained efforts to promote dialogue among Alevi leaders, scholars, and state officials. These efforts aim to incorporate Alevi identity into an official framework of national unity and social reconciliation, yet they resulted in no meaningful institutional progression. Moving beyond the AKP's well-known political pragmatism, the talk situates its Alevi policies within a longer historical trajectory, and it argues that enduring structural and political constraints embedded in the Turkish state tradition, rooted in the Ottoman legacy, have consistently hindered meaningful recognition, inclusion, and equal citizenship for the Alevis. The talk further suggests that these same constraints also shape the AKP Syria policy, particularly its approach to Alevites, the Arab Alevi population, across the border. Please join me in welcoming Professor Riza.
I have to admit that today's subject matter is not something that I am primarily specialized or I'm an expert on. But these are the questions I have been debating for a while and I'm thinking around. So I want to take this opportunity to these questions and my thought with you and probably some feedbacks, maybe in discussions and getting more into details of those methods, because these questions that I will present today, I believe, lays the foundation of the many problems that we today have in business, especially in Syria nowadays. So it's just the initial phase. Again, I want to share. And also, I'm guessing everybody has the outline, so you can see what I'm going to cover today. And I will read to keep the time, because I was told that there is a very strict deadline of 40 minutes. If you access it, the red line is flashing. So, very dangerous. Okay. So, since coming to power in 2002, the Justice and Development Party, AKP, has presented itself as a force of democratization, promising expanded religious freedoms and greater inclusion for marginalized groups. Within this discourse, the Alevi community, the largest religious minority in Turkey, has occupied a central place. Historically subjected not only to cultural marginalization but also to systematic discrimination within state institutions, Alevis have long demanded recognition of their religious identity, equal citizenship, and fair access to public resources. Against this background, the AKP's early rhetoric concerning Alevi rights generated cautious optimism both domestically and internationally. Alevi grievances have extended well beyond symbolic recognition. For decades, Alevis have faced structural exclusion from high-level state bureaucracy, limited access to public employment, and informal barriers to advancement within institutions such as the judiciary, security forces, and religious administration. Also, the distribution of public resources has overwhelmingly favored Sunni institutions and communities. These patterns have reinforced perception of second-class citizenship and shaped Alevi demands for recognition and equal rights. The most visible manifestation of the AKP's engagement with these demands was the so-called Alevi Opening, launched in 2007 and continued up until 2009. Presented as an unprecedented initiative, it sought to address the long-standing grievances through dialogue and consultation. Government officials emphasized inclusion and reconciliation, framing the process as part of a broader democratization agenda linked to Turkey's European Union access efforts. Despite its symbolic significance, the Alevi Opening failed to produce meaningful outcomes. Core demands such as the recognition of Cemalis as place of worship, reform of the Directorate of Religious Affairs, Diyanet, and change the compulsory Sunni-oriented religious education remain unmet. Just as importantly, the opening did not address entrenched patterns of discrimination in public employment or the unequal allocations of state resources. Instead, the process produced symbolic gestures and rhetorical assurances, leading many Alevi organizations to view it as performative rather than transformative. This perception was reinforced by the AKP's increasing sectarian political language following the Gezi protests. As a result, the AKP's Alevi policies deepened the sense of exclusion among Alevis and, in a sense, ended up in a disappointment for Alevis. So, why did Alevi Opening end up in such a So what is the reason? In my view, explanation that focuses solely on political pragmatism of AKP falls short. The limitation of the Alevi opening cannot be explained only by short-term calculation or policy inconsistency. Rather, they reflect deeper historical and structural constraints that have shaped state-Alevi relations over centuries. Accordingly, I argue that the AKP's Alevi policies are rooted in a long-standing religio-legal framework inherited from the Ottoman Empire. Historically, Alevis and related groups were defined as heretic and excluded from full political and institutional development. This formulation was established during the Ottoman classical period, reconfigured in the 19th century, and embedded within the foundations of the Turkish Republic. Although the Republic formally adopted secularism, it nonetheless preserved an underlying logic in which Sunni Islam remained central to state recognition, authority, and access to public resources. Within this inherited structure, Alevis have occupied an ambiguous position, formally included as citizens, yet persistently excluded from the institutional core of the nation. From this perspective, the Alevi opening did not break with the past, rather reproduced its underlying assumptions. So, to understand the structural roots of Alevi marginalization in Turkey, we must return to the formative period of the Ottoman classical regime, particularly late 15th century and the 16th centuries. During this era, the Ottoman state consolidated a political order grounded in Sunni Islamic law. In this regime, religion, law, and political authority were inseparably intertwined, and belonging to a political community was contingent upon recognition within the religio-legal framework. In a sense, the Ottoman religio-political order, often referred to as the regime of religion and state, din devlet, was consolidated as a response to the rise of the Kızılbaş movement, which posed a fundamental challenge to the Ottoman political and religious unity. Associated with the Safavid dynasty and Shiite and Sufi-inflected religious practices, the Kızılbaş were perceived by Ottoman authorities not only as religious deviants, but also as political threats. As a result, Ottoman scholars and officials increasingly framed the Kızılbaş as the defining other of the Ottoman regime. The consolidated Ottoman legal system relied on clearly defined religious categories, with Sunni Muslim constituting the normative core. Non-Muslim communities, primarily Christians and Jews, were classified as Ahl-i Dhimma, or protected peoples. Although subordinate, these groups were explicitly recognized within Islamic law and granted legal protection. Their religious difference was regulated and institutionalized. The Kızılbaş, by contrast, occupied no such category. They were neither accepted as a proper Muslim nor classified as protected non-Muslim. The absence of religio-legal definition was crucial because the Kızılbaş were outside the recognized legal taxonomy. They lacked legal protection and political legitimacy. They existed beyond the boundaries of lawful religious plurality, rendering them vulnerable to repression and violence. Ottoman fatwas increasingly declared them apostates or heretics, legitimizing coercion in the name of religious and political order. To recapitulate, defining Kızılbaş out of category was a direct outcome of the merger of religion, law, and politics. In this formulation, the Kızılbaş identity was perceived as a particularly dangerous form of difference, one that could not be accommodated within this system. Unlike Christians and Jews, whose religious identity was external to Islam, Kızılbaş Alevis represented an internal deviation that blurred the boundaries of orthodoxy and thus threatened the coherence of Sunni authority. As a result, heresy became not merely a theological judgment, but as a political category that justified exclusion, surveillance, and violence. Within this framework, the Kızılbaş were de jure non-existent, yet de facto present. They were neither legally protected nor politically legitimate. This created a modus vivendi that placed Kızılbaş Alevis in a liminal space of existence. The significance of this period lies in the structure it produced. Alevis were defined through exclusion rather than recognition and suspicion rather than accommodation. This logic would outlive the classical Ottoman order and shape the later Ottoman and Turkish policies towards heterodox Muslim communities. So that is the basic ground, the foundation of this structure that we inherit today. But in the 19th century, we have a second layer of structural change, which I'm just moving to. The 19th century marked a turning point in the Ottoman Empire's approach to heterodox Muslim communities. Faced with military defeat, territorial loss, and internal fragmentation, the empire embarked on a wide-ranging program of reform. These reforms aimed to transform the Ottoman polity into a modern, centralized state, capable of governing its population more directly. In this new political context, the long-standing exclusion of Alevis, Nusayris, and Yazidis became increasingly untenable. And I'm going to explain why. A central feature of these reforms was the redefinition of the relationship between the state and its subjects. The reforming state sought to eliminate intermediary religious and social structures and establish direct contact with individual subjects through taxation, conscription, education, and legal administration. This transformation made legal clarity essential. Every subject now had to be classified and governed within a standardized legal framework. Communities that had previously existed in ambiguous or undefined positions now posed a structural challenge to the Ottoman system. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire faced growing pressure from Protestant missionaries. By the mid-19th century, missionary activity expanded beyond Christian communities and increasingly targeted Alevis, Nusayris, and even Yazidis. Being legally uncategorized and socially marginalized, these groups were seen as particularly vulnerable for the missionary activities. For Ottoman officials, missionary success among these populations will mean not only religious loss, but also political danger, as conversion risked placing subjects under foreign protection. This new pressure, internal modernization and external missionary intervention forced the Ottoman bureaucracy to reconsider its long-standing policy of exclusion. against heterodox groups. In the classical period, the state could label heterodox groups as heretics and leave them outside the legal system. However, the modernizing empire no longer had that option. Although Alevis, Nusayris, and Yazidis to be classified as non-Muslim would undermine the integrity of the Muslim population and weaken Arab claims of sovereignty. As a result, Arab officials increasingly emphasized that Alevis, Nusayris, and Yazidis were Muslim. So, fundamental change of policy from non-Muslim to Muslim, officially. This marked a significant shift in official discourse. However, the reclassification did not translate into recognition of their religious particularities. Instead, the state adopted a new strategy. Rather than excluding heterodox Muslims from the Muslim millet, from the proper Sunni Islam, it sought to transform them. The strategy took the form of tasih itiqad, or correction of faith. Under this policy, the state launched comprehensive efforts to reshape heterodox communities into proper Sunni Muslims. Mosques and schools were established in Alevi and Syria regions. Sunni clerics were appointed, and Orthodox religious instruction was promoted. Although presented as civilizing and educational reforms, these initiatives functioned in practice as mechanisms of religious assimilation. So the Tasih Itiqad did not resolve the problem of legal recognition for others, obviously. They were included in the Muslim millet only on the condition that their difference be erased. Their beliefs were not acknowledged, and legitimate variations within Islam, not acknowledged as legitimate variations within Islam, but treated as errors requiring correction. In this sense, the 19th century replaced exclusion with coercive inclusion. This transformation had lasting consequences. By insisting on non-Muslim identity of Alevis while denying their religious legitimacy, the Ottoman state institutionalized a hierarchical model of inclusion that combined governance with discipline. Alevis were incorporated into the imperial system, yet continued to be marked as internal to others. The 19th century reforms thus did not dismantle but reconfigured earlier Arab approaches to heterodoxy, a framework that would shape the foundations of the modern republic. And now we're moving to the Republican period. The founding of the Turkish Republic foundation of the Turkish Republic in 1923 is often described as a radical break with the Ottoman past. The abolition of the caliphate, the adoption of secular law, and the recognition of political institutions marked a fundamental transformation in the formal structure of the state. Yet, despite these reforms, the Republican regime inherited and internalized key conceptual frameworks from Ottoman governments, particularly in its approach to religious differences. The Alevi question illustrates this continuity beneath the surface of secular modernization. The Republican project sought to construct a homogeneous nation based on citizenship rather than religious affiliation. Official ideology emphasized Turkishness and secularism as the foundation of national identity. In practice, however, the core of the new nation was built not solely on ethnic unity, but on a reconfigured version of the Ottoman Muslim millet. Accordingly, Sunni Islam remained the normative religious reference embedded in the state's institutional and cultural framework. It is important to note that Republican secularism did not entail state neutrality toward religion. Instead, it involved the active regulation and management of religion by the state. The establishment of the Directorate of Religious Affairs exemplified this approach, taken with tasked with overseeing religious life. The Diyanet institutionalized Sunni Islam as the only legitimate form of religious expression within the public sphere. Heterodox traditions, including Alevism, were excluded from this framework. As a result, Alevis were never officially recognized as a religious community in the Republican period. Their places of worship, Alevis, were denied legal status, and their religious practices were excluded from public religious education. This exclusion persisted despite the state's commitment to secularism. In effect, the Republic inherited the Ottoman tendency to define Alevis not as a legitimate religious group, but as a problem to be managed. This contradiction, or even paradox, lies at the heart of Republican secularism. While religion was formally separated from politics, Sunni Islam effectively continued to function as an implicit marker of normative belonging. Alevis were incorporated into the nation as citizens, but only with the condition that they dismantle of their religious identity. In fact, the state insisted on defining Alevis as Muslim while refusing to recognize the validity of their beliefs, just like the 19th century Ottoman Empire. This logic of inclusion without recognition was reinforced over time. Even during periods of political liberalization, no Republican government undertook meaningful legal reforms to define Alevism as a legitimate religious identity. Alevis were often framed as a cultural or folkloric. Mandatory religious education, particularly after the 1980 military coup, further consolidated the hierarchy by privileging Sunni doctrine. By the time the AKP came to power in the early 2000s, this structure was firmly entrenched. Despite its rhetoric of reform and pluralism, the AKP further enforced the state tradition shaped by centuries of exclusion and conditional integration. As a result, the Alevi question was already contained by a framework that could not easily accommodate religious diversity. In terms of minority incorporation, thus, the Republican period represents not a rupture with the Ottoman practice, but a reconfiguration of their life. Secularism altered the language through which religious difference was managed, but not the underlying hierarchy itself. Alevis remained internal others, citizens without recognition, included yet persistently suspect. This continuity provides the essential background for understanding both the AKP's domestic Alevi policies and its approach to religious difference beyond Turkey's boundaries. The AKP's approach to the Syrian civil war, for example, provides a revealing extension of the patterns discussed thus far. Since the outbreak of this conflict in 2011, Turkey has pursued an active and interventionist Syrian policy, offering sustained political and logistical support to opposition forces fighting the Assad regime. While this policy has often been framed in terms of humanitarian concern or regional security, its sectarian dimensions are difficult to overlook, particularly in relation to Syria's Nusayri Alevi population. From the outset, the AKP portrayed the Assad regime primarily through its association with Syria's Alewite minority. In both domestic and international discourse, the distinction between regime and community was frequently blurred. Alevites were implicitly framed as a sectarian elite, while Sunni opposition groups were presented as the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people. At the same time, Turkey extended support to a broad spectrum of Sunni opposition factions, including groups with jihadist orientation. More importantly, the AKP administration has overlooked the widespread and systematic massacre of Alawite civilians by Syrian, nowadays state forces, in 2005. This asymmetry, strong support for Sunni opposition forces combined with difference toward the persecution of Alawite civilians, cannot be explained solely by short-term geopolitical considerations. Rather, it reflects a deeper historical logic in which Sunni Islam functions as the normative reference point of political legitimacy, while heterodox groups remain positioned as morally and politically suspect. In this sense, the AKP's Syria policy reproduces the same classificatory framework that has historically shaped state attitudes towards Alevis and Nusayris. The continuity becomes clearer when viewed through an Ottoman historical lens. During the classical period, Nusayris are Alawites, were treated as heretics outside the religio-legal order, just like Kızılbaş Alevis. In the 19th century, they were subjected to policies of religious correction aimed at transforming them into proper Muslims. Under the AKP, this logic has re-emerged in a modern and geopolitical form, no longer articulated through direct religious doctrine, but through political discourse. Therefore, rather than representing a rupture with earlier state practices, the AKP's Syria policy illustrates how inherited assumptions about religious hierarchy have become more explicit. As the party consolidated power, the latent structure embedded in Turkish statecraft surfaced with greater clarity, reasserting boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate forms of Islam. And domestically, the AKP Syria policy deepened the sense of vulnerability among Turkey's Alevi population. Many Alevis interpret the government's stance as confirmation that they continue to fall outside the moral boundaries of the nation. The failure to consistently condemn violence against Alawite civilians reinforced perception of exclusion. In this way, foreign policy and domestic governance intersect, revealing a shared ideological foundation rooted in historical patterns of exclusion. So, classical period, 19th century Turkish public, and as an addendum, this is extension in the foreign policy of AKP. Now I would like to conclude my talk. I have argued today that the failure of meaningful Alevi recognition under the AKP cannot be understood as a temporary political failure or product of short-term pragmatism alone. Rather, it must be situated within a long historical trajectory extending from the Ottoman classical period into the Republican era. One should recognize that the enduring legacy of Ottoman statecraft continues to shape the contours of belonging in modern Turkey, leaving Alevis suspended in a space that is neither fully inside nor entirely outside the nation. The AKP inherited this structure and ultimately reinforced it. The Alevi opening failed not simply because of political insincerity or pragmatic calculations, which are to be surely there, but because Turkish statecraft remains anchored in a framework that cannot easily accommodate religious differences within Islam. While Alevis are formally included within the nation, their continued exclusion from bureaucratic power, institutional recognition, and material resources reveals the limits of this inclusion. As I have explained, this ambivalent position is not accidental. It reflects a hierarchically sedimented mode of governance in which Alevis have been rendered perpetually provisional, recognized as citizens yet treated as suspect, acknowledged as Muslims yet denied religious legitimacy, incorporated into nation yet excluded from its institutional code. The same logic that structures domestic Alevi policies also informs the AKP's approach to Alewite communities beyond Turkey's borders, especially in Syria. Taken together, these patterns suggest that the Alevi question in Turkey is not merely a policy issue. It is a structural problem rooted in the historical foundations of the state itself. Without confronting the inherited religio-legal hierarchies that continue to define access to recognition, resources, and power, attempts at reform are likely to remain simple.
To what extent the whole long durée exclusionary politics or pattern is to do with the state or to do with the society? What is if you think about the social fabric in the Ottoman world and then post-Ottoman, how can you see the state-society dynamic that relates to that issue?
So the short answer is also deeply embedded in society, in Sunni society, I believe. And this is not again accidental because when we look in my understanding of Ottoman polity is not just, state is not a correct term. They use hindered. So they are talking about order which is sustained by political power, coercive power, and religion. These two together create the order. And the society, to a great extent, was a production of this order. So religion is so, pervasive. It's everywhere. And religion has been shaping the people's sensibilities, perceptions, everything. And religion makes all these discriminatory structures embedded in society. Again, this is not just a state issue in an abstract modern sense. It's larger. It's an issue within the New Devlet order. And then obviously all these codes are precipitated in feelings and understanding of the Sunni society as well. It has a certain, very strong social aspect.
Thank you for the talk. I appreciated the argument a lot. I like the argument about it being a structural problem and not just a kind of specific problem of AKP policy right now?
I was just thinking about so it makes sense to me that you're thinking about this in a much deeper historical frame. And I like the idea that this is sort of a problem about sort of something foundational to the state itself. I'm in thinking of those terms, I'm also thinking more broadly about the form of the modern state more generally, not just in an Ottoman Turkish context, because some of the terms you're using, which I think are really well stated here, about Alevi citizens yet excluded, kind of included in the nation yet excluded from its institutional core. Like a lot of this also sounds very familiar to like 19th century European debates about Jewish emancipation, for instance, where they're, the cost of freedom or emancipation is their Judaic specificity or whatever. They're meant to assimilate linguistically. They're meant to leave their own kind of ghettos and all that, right? That it's meant to be kind of at the cost of their Jewishness in some sense. Which then also leads to very similar enduring problems of structural exclusion and violence, even amidst a language of freedom, inclusion, and all of that. And so I think in those in those terms, it's not sort of a story that's just specific to the kind of Ottoman Republican kind of dynamics that you're laying out so clearly here. It's an even broader kind of, broader problem.
Yeah, I mean, when we compare with the other experiences in Europe, France or Germany, so the question is, the modern state claims to be secular. And in the secular order, you cannot bring your religious identity. So it's a separate and isolated space for religion. It's not, it cannot be progressive everywhere, right? So the question is, to what extent we see the dominance of particular religious understanding in the state in the other experiences. In France, we know there's Catholicism to a certain extent, but is it as strong as the Sunni dominance of the Turkish Republic or 19th century Ottoman Empire? Or in Protestant world, it might be in a different shape. So as long as you have a historical baggage coming from your past in your purportedly secular system, the idea that, okay, we are secular citizens here doesn't work. Because you already have embedded certain understanding. We have this very clear in Turkish Republic. So I don't know details of France, for example, their experience. Probably they have a similar case, but perhaps at a lesser extent. Yeah, but in my formulation, actually, I see 19th century Turkish Republic as one block, Western period as one block. One is exclusion, the other one is changing, transforming inclusion. And the funny thing is, it's actually not funny, it's dramatic. Even if they converted, they were not that proper members of the Muslim community. They're labeled differently. So it's a very deeply embedded structural issue here.
Thank you so much for this talk. Our minds are working comparatively, and I would like to kind of draw our attention to another comparison. When we talk about exclusion in Turkey, it's usually, or dominantly, especially in the political discourse, through thinking about Kurdish exclusion. So I would like you to reflect on that. One is a religious hierarchy, the other one is an ethnic hierarchy, but the ways in which you're thinking about it historically, how does it apply to Kurdish? Because, the Alevi faith and the society and the political discourse. So I would like to have a sort of your perspective on the other side. And I have another question about the, it's structural, and I really appreciate that argument too. But there are moments of democratization and then closure again. So in what ways we should think about those cycles
You mean the Republican period?
As well as, yeah, Alevi. I mean, I mean, the reason why I'm asking is this: it's not just the structure, but some things about the Alevi agency or organization or making politics or sort of demanding something changes throughout. And what can you say about the yeah? And lastly, if I may, it sounds like you really targeting the religion like as a bigger problem, although we know that the modern state has its own problems. So you're thinking about maybe religious reformation and what is going on in that area, like in terms when we think about the Alevis throughout, like more in theological sort of discussions about how to sort of bring Alevis as equal.
Yeah. So let me start with the last one. Yes, I pay attention to religion much, and I consider religion very, very important to understand everything going on around. It's not because I want some reformation in the field of religion or I want people to become more religious. It's because in my understanding, the very infrastructure of the social, cultural, political establishment goes back to the religious references in this geography. So let me jump to the first question and combine them together. This is always very fascinating to me thinking about the nationalism in Turkey. When we say Turkish nation, Turkish, so then we have right? They're the champions of Turkish nationalism. But as I see, when you scratch the surface of Turkish nationalism, you find Sunni Islam beneath. So there's muhafazakar, milliyetçi, muhafazakar, this combination. So muhafazakar is very important there. So even the nationalism is based on this religious understanding, and it's understandable because it goes back to the Sunni millet in the Ottoman taxonomy. Even today, when you think of Turkish population, there are minorities, and there is a majority. And now lately, especially after the protest, this might turning point. Now we have another minority in Turkey, which is secular Turks, seculars. So we already have Alevis. We have Christian minorities. They are proper minorities, by the way. Even in the foundation of the Turkish Republic, the Lausanne Treaty, the only religious minority defined there is Christian minorities. The minorities that is well defined in the millet system of Ottoman Empire. Alevis are not minority in this theory, Lausanne Treaty, and Muslims are not minority because they are living in Turkey. Now we have a third group, or I don't know, the secular minorities. But it's very shocking to me to observe nowadays, the very hot developments are happening in Syria right now. And then in Turkey, lots of Turks, secular Turks, Kemalist Turks are supporting jihadist groups against Kurds. That's interesting to me. And why is it happening? What might be the background to this? And it looks like, I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like to me, even here, religion is the primary reference. So the seculars are secular. The major group, the major denomination is Sunni Muslims. It doesn't matter if they are jihadists or not. They are Sunni and they are, in that sense, somehow proper Muslim. So, even for religious Kurds, that's a very interesting question. What is their position right now? Even in the Kurdish population, now it's very sensitive. So I'm not sure, I cannot talk about the situation right now, but I know, like 5-10 years ago, within the Turkish population, especially when AKP came to power, they divided into two. And the muhafazakar vote for AKP. Because religion is very important. That's a very strong denomination. And we have this historical inheritance. For Alevis, that's whole another story. The experience of Alevi communities during the urbanization and facing the modern ideology, especially Kemalism and socialism, fundamentally changed the fabric of Alevi society. So during this period, when we look at politically, not the structural elements, but when you look at the political climate of Turkey, probably the most favorable term for Alevis was 90s in Turkey. Because the Kemalist bureaucracy saw the Islamist threat and they considered Alevis as a back power for secularism. They supported indirectly. Politically, that was a very favorable term for Alevis. But during this term, we didn't see any single legal development recognizing Alevis as Alevis. So it all goes back to this religious taxonomy, in my understanding.
Thank you, that was fascinating. I have 3 questions, and the first one you may have mentioned, and I'm sorry if I missed it. What percent of the population declare that they're Alevis? Has that changed in any kind of significant way with the folks coming over from Syria? Is that makeup more Alevi or not? So that's the first part of the question, more on the numbers and percentages. 2, if we go further back in history, there's obviously a reason why Alevis practice differently, not go to the mosque, etc., etc. What are the reasons for those differences, and do they constitute part of the structure? Not within the contents of Turkey, of course, but I'm sure they carry some baggage with them. And then lastly, this is just kind of my personal observation, it seems like the topic of being an Alevi and the differences and expectations, treatment, etc., became much more openly talked about, I'd say, in the last 25, 30 years. That may just be my age and my absorption of the information, but do you see that, and why is that?
Yes, so the population, I used to believe, we don't have the accurate numbers. I used to believe that Alevis constituted like some 15% of the population. 15, not 50. Just 15. I suspect it's now even less. Those people came from Syria, they were probably Sunni. They are more Sunni than Turkish, most Sunni Turks. So Turkey, that immigration also increased the coefficient of Sunniness in Turkey. And probably the percentage of Alevis dropped a little bit. The second question?
The historical reasons why they practice differently.
That's a very good
Like not
point. I mean, so within Islam, actually, when we go back to different sections of Islam in different geographies, different regions, there have not been that unanimity. So there's always a diversity, but the problem is the people who are writing and who are controlling political power and central resources has one voice, and they represent the Orthodox version, and then we learn this version only. So as a scholar of religion and religious studies, I think in the 16th century, for example, if you look at the population of Anatolia, you wouldn't consider them as Sunni as we understand Sunnism right now. So these are changing. And then praying 5 times in mosque or in the prayer namaz Yeah, there are some other interpretation of Islam which considers spiritual experience higher than this legal obligations. It's a very complicated process. And the last question?
The last question was, do you see that Alevism kind of talked about more
Yes,
openly,
yes.
at least more openly?
Yeah, thank you very much for asking this, because that looks like a contradiction to my arguments about our AKP policies, right? So we've seen all of these much more visible during the AKP period than before. But this is not because of AKP. This is because of the global changes, and even before AKP, as I said, in the 1990s, all of these were visible, but actually they became visible by the 1980s and especially 1990s. AKP again inherited an existing situation, and they used Alevi card as a leverage against European Union, against the army and Kemalist bureaucracy. So they used this, the maneuver, this very successfully, and it worked at this time. So look, they created an image that they were going to do those openings for minority groups, and they did those meetings, etc. But eventually, when it comes to real decisions and regulations, we don't have anything.
Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. I have 3 questions as well. And 2 of them are about some of the common talking points in the popular media or academia. One is like the fact that, the claim that the allegation that Ottoman Empire was actually not so Sunni until Selim I, but because of the Safavid conflict, in competition with them and to basically identify as something against them, adopted Sunnification and Sunni identity. What is your view on that? Second is about a talking point among the AKP supporters in Turkey who say, who use the term like Cededun Aşık for CHP, for Alevis and CHP relationship, being enamored by your butcher, basically. Like they say, there were lots of massacres against Alevis by the public. Chief among them is the Darcy massacre, and the Alevis must be normally, more prone to supporting the AKP, especially with the liberalization era. But instead they kept on, supporting CHP, and that is a contradictory, standpoint. And this goes also for the Syrian case, because in Syria, along with Armenians, among Alevis, there were a lot of support for the Assad regime. So do you find wisdom in that attitude, or do you find contradiction in that attitude? And thirdly, when I was hosting Zeynep Türkyılmaz in Istanbul at our organization, so after she presented her paper, an Alevi stood up and he said, "Oh, I've been Alevi, and our family is a strong Alevi family, and there is nothing in what you presented common to us." So because she was presenting from a Kurdish Alevi perspective. So one thing that I'd like to address is the tensions between different ethnic groups among Alevis, Turkish Alevis, Arab Alevis, and Kurdish Alevis. Relationship or tensions, and what are the dynamics of that relationship? Because sometimes you don't find them, you find them at odds with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Sunnitization of Ottoman system or Ottoman Empire, that's a very long, topic. But my understanding about Sunnitization, my understanding of Sunnitization focuses on the collaboration between political power and legal system. So it's, if you look at the, the interpretation of Islam, the books, fiqh books or other books, the mainstays of interpretations are more or less the same in the books. So you will not see too many differences between books written in the 16th, 17th century on Aqaid and books written in the 13th, 12th century on Aqaid. The difference actually comes in the practice. And this practice is related to the collaboration, cooperation between the state in the other sense. Actually, the other sense state includes the law, right? So, the political power and the legal system. If we think of the transition to the Ottoman Empire, at least my understanding is, the earlier phase of the Ottoman polity was based on Turco-Mongolian model, which distinguished Turco-Mongolia. And basically it distinguished between the military political elites ruling the country and the subjects being ruled. And there's terms for it, askeri and reaya. Askeri means those people who are really soldier and ruling, political and military. And within the askeri class, there is another set of laws, Torah. That's important. So the Sharia is for the subjects. And it was there all the time, always. But the political system, the relationship within the ruling elites was based on Torah, which comes from the Islamic tradition. So that changed gradually in the 16th century. And the Sharia became more and more pervasive in the whole system. That excluded or that shrunk the spaces for heterodox groups and eventually exclude them at all from the whole system, because Sharia is very clear. It's a system of law, as described and defining everything. So from this perspective, Sunnitization happened, yes, by the late 15th century and 16th century. But if you focus on the faith, the Aqaid itself, because long history, and you can find the same beliefs in the very early threads as well. The second thing that's very, I hear this all the time, the Alevis sympathy to Atatürk and CHP, and this is being interpreted as Stockholm Syndrome or being in love with a butcher. That's nonsense to me. Why? Because they know the Turkish Republic was not an Alevi Republic. And as I explained today, the Republic even did not recognize Alevism as a religious identity. And they know that. They knew that. You know. But the difference, there is a difference. In the Ottoman legal system, even after the transformation and force in the 19th century, the foundation undergirding structure is still Sharia. And in the Sharia, they are undefined. So, being legally undefined is something worse.
They're undefined or they're the
Out of category.
The heron?
Yeah, that means beyond the pale. So there are Sunni Muslims, Sunni Millet, Muslim Millet. There are Orthodox Millet. There are Catholic Millet, later Protestant Millet. These are defined. They were not equal with the ruling Sunni Muslims, but they were defined and they had rights. Alevis were undefined. So they did not exist legally. That's the worst thing. And then during the Republic, at least in theory, even though the codes are still embedded in the whole system and especially the society, the people who are running the system, but at least normatively, in theory, you had a chance to become a citizen by leaving your Alevi identity. That's a progress. That's why they like literature. And diversity in Alevis, there is a very high degree of diversity nowadays, especially. So it's simply impossible to talk about the whole Alevi identity today, I suppose. So if you ask me about traditional Alevism, which is up until the 60s, 70s, I can talk about it. And I can draw a picture for you, which will be 80-20% accurate. But for the contemporary Alevis, whatever you say, there is another group who doesn't fit in it. So yeah, there's a very, very diverse situation right now. And this diversity goes on the lines of ethnicity, the relationship with Islam, relation to religion as a whole, secularism versus religion, and also socialism, Kemalism. There are too many factors here.
Thank you.
Sorry. One more follow-up question. I thought about it in mind, but
What's the status today of, like, how are those institutions recognized today? Are they like community centers, or are they in the same spot as a synagogue and a church, or what are they?
Yeah, so legally they are association. If you look at the legal documents, they are association. De jure, they are association. De facto, they are genuine, and everybody knows. That's the real thing. So and even state officials, they visit Germany. They know that this is a place for, religious practice and prayer. Jam is a religious ritual. Everybody knows it, but legally still we're not there. And even, there is, I didn't mention about this, they created a unit within the bureaucracy, in Turkish bureaucracy, Alevi, Bektashi, Başkanlık. So there is a Başkanlık now. But this is under Ministry of Culture, I think. Not Diyanet, so it's still not religion. So you are good as a cultural entity, you are good as a folkloric entity, but you cannot be a religious entity. Why? Because there is only one religious entity, and it signifies the unity of the country in their mind. That is the inheritance from the Ottoman Empire. So they cannot go beyond it. I'm not optimistic about this, because in the near future, I don't expect any government, if the AKP changes, hopefully, this is also another low possibility. Even if they change, I'm not optimistic that in the near future, Alevi and Alevi identity will be recognized as a religious entity.
As far as I know, there was some resistance within the Alevi community to be defined actually legally, because they obviously don't want to be part of Diyanet, but also at least a group within the Alevi community were claiming that we don't want to be defined by the state and be part of that kind of religious bureaucracy.
There are those groups too, yes. But I'm not sure whether they know what they're talking about. Because, this is not tenable again, for all of these too. You are living under the authority of this state. You fulfill all the responsibilities of citizens for the state. You have right to be the citizen of this state as Alevi. And that requires a kind of definition. When we talk about the legal domain, it's always about definition. So there are groups who would like to keep those undefined territories for themselves, but I don't think they're thinking what they're talking about for all.
Quick question. Considering the Ba'ath Party and the connection and how the Alevis were perceived within Turkey, well, the Alewite connection with the Ba'ath Party and connection with Iran as well, that would be interesting as well. That's probably changed quite a bit after the recent events in Syria.
Yeah, so three aspects of this question, right? The relation between Alevites and Syria with the Ba'ath regime, relationship between Alevis of Turkey with Iran, and the relationship between Alevis of Turkey with Ba'ath regime, right? Three relationships. So to be honest, I don't know much about the relationship between Alevites and Ba'ath regime before all these changes happened. I was not very much interested in this side. But later on, from my readings, I mean, probably I don't know much more than you, but my impression is even the Ba'ath regime was not an Alawite regime. So when you look at the distribution of power, the major institutions, major positions, the Sunnis were majority. This is what I hear from the experts. But obviously, there was a favorable position for Alevites too. Yeah, that's undeniable. They probably kept the Secret Service and that kind of sensitive institutions of the state. But Alevis of Turkey and the Assad regime, Ba'ath regime, I don't know anything about this. I mean, I've been working in this field for a very long time right now, since 1998, I started my master's. So I have never, it never came into my agenda. So we became aware of Syria, or we were very much interested in Syria, especially when they started to slaughter Alevites there. Because, the underlying structure working. The thing for Alevis of Turkey now is we belong to the same categorized group, same uncategorized group. If they are doing them there, they will do the same thing to us here. That's the source of fear. That creates a, convergence between Alevites and Alevis, and this convergence is getting very, very, affected lately.
Can I ask?
The Iran one? So that's, it's very difficult for Iran to attract Alevis of Turkey. Why? Because this is not about being Shiite. The difference, the major difference between Alevis and Sunnis lie in their religiosity, not in their doctrine. Doctrine is not so important to people. Religiosity means the practice, the structures that you practice in religion. For example, Alevis do not pray 5 times. That's important. Alevis like Ali, okay, but they do not practice. They drink alcohol. That's important. These are the markers, okay? When you look, so they are not Sharia based. This religiosity is not Sharia based. That's the primary marker. When you look at the Orthodox 12 or Shiism, it's also Sharia based. And in that sense, it is closer to Sunni Orthodoxy than Alevism, in the eyes of Alevis. So, Alevis see that they are praying 3 times usually, but the same logic, same practice, it's all fiqh-based religion. And the difference, Alevis is not fiqh-based. Therefore, whatever Shiism, the official Shiism of Iran, cannot be successful among Alevis. They are doing, they do propaganda, and they convert some people too, not all them. But it's not that huge number, and it cannot be a huge number by expectation.
Okay, I have 2 questions. One kind of a comment. First, the historical question, if you like. The Ottoman, obviously, a very complicated system and it's complicated political order and everything, but a couple of things too, not to challenge you obviously, but to make, like, look at the Bektashi's, right? I mean, Bektashism was a legitimate order in the Ottoman system. It's not only legitimate, it is the order of the main military group. Janissaries or Bektashis. So in a way, this heterodox structure was embedded in the Ottoman system.
Yeah.
So we have to deal with this problem. We talked about this many years. How can we explain this? And what happened when 19th century when Bektashism and Janissaries were abolished and Bektashism became illegal and heresy. And the oldest, Naqshbandi groups took over the Bektashi, lodges and everything. It was a very interesting story. Also, the Ottoman system recognized Mount Lebanon, for instance, as legitimate, or Najaf. I mean, it's not only, the Iraqi, Shiite, in Mount Lebanon, Shiism or something. It's not about Shiism, obviously, it's more complicated. So I think, and you might also have, you'd like to refer, complicate the story, not only Bektashism, but also the status of Shiism in the Ottoman system or something. But this is the Ottoman aspect. You don't need to answer this question. For this structural exclusion, we agree on that. And also the hierarchy between Sunnis and other groups. I would put, in a way, Hanafism as the top of the hierarchy, not Sunnism. Turkey Republic is very much Hanafi structures. Same hierarchy can be applied for the other Sunni groups. Istanbul municipality recognized, for instance, recently the Kurdish Shafi groups. This created another problem, as you know. So Hanafism is the top of the hierarchy. But then for the Erdogan and for AK Party, is it okay? There's structural thing, but there's no pragmatic thing. There's pragmatism because a kind of an Alevi Republican, Alevi opposition, where the CHP was, the leader was Alevi, the Alevis were very much like part of the CHP movement. And Alevi opposition is very instrumental. It's very useful to reproduce this hierarchy, right? So, we recognize even the opposition parties, led by Alevi leader, but we are the, so there's structural thing, but there's a pragmatism there, or opportunism rather. There. And then in Turkish democratic politics, actually, the exclusionary structure also, was reproduced. This is almost not only the statecraft, this is the nature of Turkish democratic order.
Actually,
Sorry.
we have this. The second thing that you mentioned is very illuminative. For my case, because during this time, especially when the civil war in Syria started, he did it before too, but especially during this period, professionally, intentionally, programmatically, Erdogan and AKP gave this message to their masses that these are Alevi. And this is, symbolic communication with their constituency. At the same time, they were still, the Alevi opening was not very successful at this time, but they were still talking about, doing something for Alevis. We're talking about two different levels, two different domains of, ground. On the discourse level, or when they speak about policies, they're talking, we are the ones who gave the most right to Alevis, they're speaking freely, etc., etc. And most recently, they did not talk bad openly about Alevis either. They were careful about that. But in the meantime, especially in their mass rallies, he used that messaging to the underlying structures so most effectively. You know, he was identifying Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu with as a regime by referring to Alevi background. And these were the real effective things for the voters. They feel it. They have the reciprocity there. So that's again what I refer as infrastructure. It's there. I mean, when you speak that language, this mass get it. And you cannot explain intellectually. For those people who are getting this message emotionally, this is an emotional message, not an intellectual. You cannot explain, oh man, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has nothing to do with the Assad regime, he's a different, he's a Kemalist, he's a secular, he's actually not pro-Alevi, etc. It doesn't matter. You cannot convince them by information because the underlying structure is there. And that's a very good example for this.
Let's end here. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for all.